Silas Renwick had kept the Blackmoor moors for 30 years. 60 winters had bent his back, and on the morning the shooting party gathered on the high heather, the young master tore the old rifle from his hands and held it up before them all, like a dead rat pulled from a trap. Spotted with rust, tied at the stock with a strip of leather, Silas did not reach for it. He did not colour. He only lowered his eyes to the heather at his boots. Rupert Fanchot turned the rifle to the guns and drawled it out slow, so every man could hear. "Gentlemen, behold a museum piece and its curator. Neither has struck anything worth striking in 40 years. 40 guests laughed. He tossed the rifle into the wet grass at the old man's feet and told him to be out of the keeper's cottage by Michaelmas. But at the far end of the line, the guest of honour lifted his head. A duke, silver-haired, he had said almost nothing all morning, and at one single word he went very still. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one thing for me. Subscribe, and in the comments tell me which city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this old soldier's story travels. Write it down now. Then come back and let me tell you the whole of it. Because you have to understand the man first. Long before the Duke, long before the shot, long before any of them learned his name. The village was called Kelthwaite. It sat low in a fold of the North Riding of Yorkshire, under a great sweep of moor that ran purple in August and iron-grey the rest of the year. Above it stood Blackmoor Hall, and between the hall and the open moor stood a small stone cottage with a slate roof and a low door, and in that cottage lived the keeper. Silas Renwick had walked those moors 30 years. He knew every butt and every beck. He knew where the grouse dusted themselves at dawn and where the deer came down at dusk to drink. He knew the moor the way a man knows the lines of his own hand, and the moor, in its slow and patient way, knew him. He was a wide man through the shoulders, though the years had begun to fold him inward. Grey had come in at his temples and then taken the rest. His hands were work-hardened and slow to warm. He had a plain, steady face that gave nothing away. When he spoke it was quiet, and it was seldom. Most days the only voice on the high ground was his, low, calling the dog to heel. The old Viscount Ellersby had loved him. That much the village knew. Before the old man died, and he had been dead now 3 months, he had taken Silas by the wrist in the great hall and made him a promise. The cottage was his for life, £30 a year while breath was in him. "You've kept my moor better than I kept my own house, Renwick," the old Viscount had said. "You'll not want while I've a say in it." But the old Viscount had no say now. He lay in the churchyard, 3 rows from the wall, and near him, closer to the yew, lay Silas's own wife, Martha, 12 years gone. Silas walked past her stone every Sunday and most weekdays besides. He never said much there either. He only stood a while, hat in his hand, and then walked on up to the moor. He was not alone in the cottage. There was the boy. Tom Renwick was 14. His mother had been Silas's daughter, and she and the boy's father were both under the ground now, taken by the fever in one hard winter, and the boy had come to the old man to be raised. Tom worked the shoots as a beater, walking the gorse to put the birds up, and the rest of the year he ran the moor at his grandfather's heel and learnt the trade. He was a good boy, quick, eager, hungry the way growing boys are hungry, and Silas would keep him fed. That was the whole of it, when you came down to it, to die in the cottage where Martha lay near, and to keep the boy fed until he could feed himself. Silas Renwick asked nothing more of his life than that. Every night he cleaned a rifle. It was an old thing, a 2-groove Brunswick, a soldier's weapon, though no soldier would have known it now. The barrel was spotted with rust. The stock was scarred and dark, and where it had once split it was bound with a strip of leather, worn soft as cloth. It was not a keeper's gun. A keeper's gun is a fowling piece, made for birds. This was made for men. He never once raised it to a bird. In 30 years the boy had never seen it fired at anything at all. But every night, when the supper things were cleared and the fire had settled to a red glow, Silas took it down from above the hearth and cleaned it, oiled the lock, ran a rag down the barrel, wiped the stock, set it back on its pegs. Every night, the same. One evening the boy asked him, he was young enough still to ask, "Granda, why'd you keep the old rusty thing? It'll not fire. You never shoot it. Why not sell it and buy a proper gun?" Silas did not look up from the lock. His hands went on moving, slow and sure. "It kept better men than me," he said. And that was all. The boy waited for more, the way a boy does, but there was no more coming. There never was. Silas set the rifle back on its pegs and banked the fire, and that was the end of it. Tom thought his grandfather a strange old man that night. He was not the last to think so. But you did not press Silas Renwick. The village loved him without quite knowing why. He mended the parson's gate and would take no coin for it. He carried coal to the widow Hartley when the snow lay deep. He pulled a boy out of the flooded beck one spring and walked home dripping and said nothing of it, and the whole of Kelthwaite heard the tale from the boy and never once from Silas. He was the sort of man a village leans on without noticing it leans, the way you lean on a wall you have known all your life. Solid, quiet, there, and that was the man. Now you know him. Hold him in your mind, the old keeper, the rusted rifle, the boy, the cottage, the grave near the yew, because the guns were coming, and they did not know him at all. Rupert Fanshawe came up from London in the last week of August. He was 26. He was the old Viscount's grandson, and by the death of his grandfather and the earlier death of his father, he was now master of Blackmoor Hall. Master of the moor, the cottage, the whole of it. He arrived in a hired carriage with a great deal of luggage and a valet, and a manner that filled a room before he did. He was handsome enough, in the soft way of men who have never wanted for anything. He wore town clothes cut close, and a watch chain that caught the light. He looked at the hall the way a man looks at a thing he means to sell, and he looked at the moor the way a man looks at a card he means to play. Because Rupert Fanshawe was in trouble, though he wore it lightly. The hall was mortgaged. £8,000 owed to the Northern Counties and Yorkshire Bank, and the whole sum falling due at Michaelmas, the 29th of September, 6 weeks off. £8,000. It was a fortune. It was a millstone. His grandfather had borrowed against the estate in his last years, and Rupert had done nothing but add to it in town, at the tables and the tailors, and now the reckoning had a date on it, and the date was close. He had a plan, of course. His sort always has a plan. The plan was the Duke. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Carrow, was to be his guest of honour. A 3-day shoot on the famous Blackmoor grouse, the finest driven birds in the north, Rupert told everyone who would listen, and at the end of it, when the Duke was warm with sport and good claret and better company, Rupert meant to ask him to stand surety at the bank. A Duke's name on the paper and the millstone lifted. That was the whole of the shoot. It looked like sport. It was a rescue, and so everything had to be perfect, everything had to be modern and grand and worthy of a duke, which was the trouble with the keeper. Rupert met Silas on the second day, up at the butts, where the old man was cutting back the heather that had grown ragged at the shooting stands. He looked at Silas the way you look at a piece of furniture you have inherited and don't much care for, the bent back, the old coat patched at the elbow, the plain, slow face. And the rifle, for Silas had it slung across his shoulder that day, as he often did on the high ground, out of long habit that no one had ever asked him to explain. "You're the keeper," Rupert said. It was not a question. "I am Sir Renwick, Silas Renwick, sir, 30 years on this moor." 30 years. Rupert said it the way a man says a smell. He turned to the fellow beside him, a younger man in bright new tweed, all creases and confidence, who had come up from town at Rupert's own hand. "Croft, come and look at what I've been keeping." Julian Croft was 30 and fashionable, and he looked Silas over and smiled the small smile of a man who already has the other man's job, because that was what Croft was. Rupert had imported him from a smart southern estate to be the new keeper of Blackmoor, a modern keeper, a keeper who looked well in the photographs and talked well to the guests, a keeper fit for a duke to see. "He's had a good long run of it," Croft said, looking at Silas but speaking to Rupert. "You can see the moor wants a firmer hand." Silas said nothing. He stood with the shears in his hand and his eyes on the middle distance, and he waited, the way he had waited all his life, for the gentleman to be done talking. "The cottage is wanted, Renwick," Rupert said. "Mr. Croft here will be taking over the keepering. You'll want to make your arrangements. Be out by Michaelmas." Michaelmas, the same day as the debt, though of course Silas did not know that, not yet, and neither did the boy. Silas took it the way he took the weather. There was a small stillness in him, no more. "The old Viscount," he began, and his voice was very level. "Your grandfather, sir, he give me his word. The cottage for my life. £30 a year. He took my wrist and my grandfather is dead," Rupert said, "and the estate is mine. And I've a use for the cottage. Sentiment's a fine thing, Renwick, but it doesn't pay for the roof." He had already turned half away. "Michaelmas, don't make a business of it." And then his eye fell on the rifle across the old man's shoulder, and his mouth curled. "Good God! What is that?" Silas's hand went to the strap, not quickly. "A rifle, sir. A rifle." Rupert laughed, and Croft laughed with him, on cue. "It's a length of rusted pipe tied up with a bootlace." "Croft, look at it. Look at the state of the man. This is what's been walking my moor." He shook his head, delighted with himself. "Well, it's of a piece, I suppose, the old relic and his older relic. Get it off my ground before the Duke sees it, there's a good fellow." He walked on, Croft at his heel, still laughing about it, and their laughter carried back on the wind across the heather to where the old man stood, quite still, the rifle on his shoulder and the shears in his hand. Silas did not answer. He turned back to the ragged heather and went on cutting it. But that night, by the fire, he cleaned the rifle a long while, longer than his custom, and the boy watched him from the settle and did not ask him anything at all. That was the first of it. It was not the last. The great party came 2 days after, and with them the shooting began, and with the shooting began the rest. There is a way a gentleman speaks to a servant that is worse than a blow, because a blow is at least a kind of attention. Rupert had it perfectly. He had Silas load for the guns at the first drive, not because Croft could not do it, but because it pleased him to have the old keeper stand at his elbow like a footman, handing up the guns, taking them back spent. "Load, Renwick, quickly now. The birds won't wait for your knees." And Silas loaded. Here is the thing the gentleman did not see, because they were not the sort of men who see such things. Silas Renwick's hands, loading, were a wonder. They moved with an economy that had no waste in it anywhere. Powder, wad, ball, ram, cap, smooth, folded, quick, a single unbroken motion that a man could watch 100 times and never catch the seam of. It was the loading of a man who had once loaded under fire, when the loading was the difference between the next breath and no more breaths at all, and the hands had never forgotten it though the mind had put it away. One of the guests noticed, an older man, a colonel of something once, standing at the next butt. He watched Silas load twice, and then a third time, and a frown came over his face, and he leaned to the man beside him. "That's a soldier's hands, that. Where'd Fanchai find him?" He watched again. "You know, there was a fellow out in the Punjab when I was a subaltern, a rifleman, Yorkshire man. They told a tale about him you'd not credit. Made a shot at Chilianwala that—" He stopped. He laughed at himself, a short, embarrassed laugh, and shook his head. "Listen to me. half a lifetime ago. Old men and old wars. Load the guns, Renwick, don't mind me. And it passed. It passed the way such things pass, a spark struck on wet ground, gone before it caught. The colonel went back to his birds. The name Chilianwalla hung a moment on the moor air and then blew away with the powder smoke, and no one there thought of it again that day. But someone had said it. Remember that a man had said it, out loud on the moor. The story was in the field now, even if no one could yet read it. The boy nearly read it that same week, in his own small way. Tom had been sent up to the cottage in the middle of the day to fetch his grandfather's second coat, for the weather had turned. He went in through the low door and crossed to the chest where the coats were kept, and he had the lid up before he saw that the coat was lying over something. A bundle, oilcloth, dark with age, tied with cord. Tom did not mean anything by it. He was a boy, and a bundle a boy has never seen is a thing that pulls the hand toward it. He touched the cord. Leave that. Silas was in the doorway. Tom had not heard him come. The old man crossed the room in 3 strides, quicker than Tom had ever seen him move, and put his own hand flat on the oilcloth, gentle but final. That's not for handling, boy. Take your coat and get down to the butts, they'll want the beaters. There was no anger in it. There was something else, something Tom had no word for, a sort of guarding. Silas stood with his hand on the bundle until the boy was gone, and then he sat a while on the edge of the chest, in the middle of the day, with the work waiting, and he did not move for a long time. Tom told no one. But he thought about it. What would an old man guard like that, who guarded nothing else in the world? He turned it over, walking down to the butts, and he could make nothing of it, and after a while the gorse and the birds drove it out of his head. But it was in him now, seed in dark ground. And then came the morning the whole thing broke open. The morning I told you of at the first. You have been waiting for it. So had they all, though none of them knew. The full party was out, 40 guns, the flower of 3 counties, and the Duke himself at the centre of the line, silver-haired and quiet, a man who watched more than he spoke. Rupert was in high colour, loud with the pleasure of being watched, half a bottle brave. The drive had gone poorly. He had shot badly and blamed the beaters and the light and the birds, everything but his own hands, and a man who has been made small in front of the people he means to impress will look about him for someone smaller to make smaller still. He found Silas at the end of the line. The old man was standing where he always stood, a little apart, out of the way of the guns, the rusted rifle on his shoulder as it always was. And Rupert saw it, and saw his chance to be the wit of the morning, and he strode down the line calling out so the whole company would turn and see. No, no, gentlemen, you must all see this. You must. He reached the old man, and before Silas could so much as shift, took hold of the rifle and pulled it off his shoulder. Silas's hand half rose and then fell. He did not fight for it. He never fought for anything. Rupert held it up over his head. In the grey morning light it looked worse than ever, the rust, the leather binding, the scarred old stock. He held it up the way a man holds up something he has pulled out of a drain. Behold, he cried, a museum piece and its curator. Neither has struck anything worth striking in 40 years. And 40 gentlemen laughed. It rolled down the line, that laughter, gun to gun, 40 men of the finest blood in the north laughing at an old man on a moor, and the sound of it went out over the heather and had nowhere to go and came back again. Rupert threw the rifle down into the wet grass at Silas's boots. Out of the cottage by Michaelmas, he said, wiping his hand on his coat as though the thing had dirtied it. I'll not have relics on my ground, living or iron. Now here is the moment. Watch it close, because everything turns on it, though you cannot yet see how. Silas Renwick did not answer. He did not colour. He did not lift his eyes to the man who had shamed him, or to the 40 who had laughed. He bent, slowly, an old man's careful bend, one hand to his knee, and he took the rifle up out of the mud. He wiped the wet from the stock with his own sleeve, patient, the way you would wipe a child's face. And he straightened and slung it back on his shoulder and stood as he had stood before. He said nothing. There was nothing in his face at all, and that nothing was the largest thing on the whole of that moor, though not one of the gentlemen could read it. The boy could not bear it. Tom was there, among the beaters, close enough to see and hear it all. And when the laughter rolled down the line, his face went scarlet, not with anger at the gentleman, God forgive him, but with shame at his own grandfather. Shame that the man he belonged to was the joke of 40 lords. Shame that he shared the name. He looked at the ground, and he would not lift his eyes. And when at last the drive moved on, and he had to pass near Silas, he could not meet the old man's face. He looked away, his own grandfather, and he looked away. Silas saw it. Of everything on that moor, the master, the laughter, the mud, the rifle in the wet, the one thing that reached him was the boy turning his eyes away. You could not have seen it if you did not know him. But it reached him. It went in like a long, thin blade, and it stayed, and still he said nothing. At the far end of the line, one man had not laughed. The Duke of Carrow had gone very still at the first of it. When Rupert cried out his little joke, a museum piece, and its curator, the Duke's head had come up. Not at the joke, at something under it. He stood with his gun broken over his arm, and he watched the old keeper bend for the rifle in the mud, and wipe it on his sleeve, and sling it back without a word, and a look came over the Duke's face that no one was near enough to read. He said nothing to anyone. But he did not shoot again that morning. He walked the moor with his eyes on the old man's back, and a thing was working in him. Far down, a thing he could not yet bring up into the light. Silas walked home alone that evening, the long way, past the churchyard. He stopped at the wall. He took off his hat. Martha's stone stood grey in the last of the light, near the yew, and near it the old Viscount's newer stone, and the two of them there together seemed to Silas the only two people left in the world who had known what he was. And they were under the ground, the both of them, and their word had gone under with them. He stood a long time. He could end it. He knew. He could go up to the hall this night and stand before the young master and the Duke and the whole grand company, and he could tell them. He could unwrap the oilcloth on the great table and let them read what was in it. He could say the name the regiment had called him and watch their faces turn. He could buy back the cottage and the £30 and the boy's respect all in one telling. He did not so much as think of it. That was the strange thing in the man, the thing the boy could not understand and the gentleman could not conceive. To Silas Renwick the past was dead and decently buried, and a man did not dig up the dead to save his own comfort. What he had done, he had done. It kept no one warm now. It belonged to other men, better men, most of them under foreign ground these 30 years, and he would not sell their memory to a fool who threw rifles in the mud. He would take the shame. He would keep his mouth shut and his back straight. He would find the boy another roof if it came to that. But he would not beg with the dead. "Not while I've breath," he said to Martha's stone, and put his hat back on, and went home to clean the rifle. "Now, you have held the man a good while, and you love him, I know you do. I built it so, and I will not make you wait for the truth any longer, because you must hold the whole of it while the gentlemen still hold none. Let me take you back 30 years and half the world away, so you know what none of them on that moor yet knew. Chilianwala, the Punjab, the 13th of January, 1849. It was one of the worst days the British Army had known in that country. A great battle in bad ground, thorn scrub and broken nullahs, fought half in a storm as the light failed, so that regiments lost each other in the smoke, and the rain came down on the wounded where they lay. It was the kind of fight the survivors did not much like to speak of after. A near thing. A butcher's day. There was a young lieutenant in the cavalry that day named Edmund Vane. He was 22, well-born, well-liked, and by the middle of that afternoon he was as good as dead. His horse had gone down under him, shot through, and pinned his leg beneath its dead weight in the churned mud of a nullah, and he could not get free. The tide of the fight had rolled over him and left him there, half under his own horse, in the smoke, alone, and out of the smoke came a Sikh sowar, a horseman, a big man on a big horse, with a tulwar, a curved sabre, bright even in that grey light. He saw the pinned officer, he wheeled his horse, and he came on at the walk, in no hurry at all, the way a man comes to a thing that cannot run, and he raised the sabre up over Edmund Vane's bare head. Vane saw it come. He said, long after, that he had time to think it was a clean day to die on, which is the sort of foolish thing a young man thinks. He could not reach his pistol, he could not move his leg. He watched the sabre go up against the grey sky, and he waited for it to come down. It did not come down. Away off on the far ridge, better than 200 yards through the smoke and the failing light, across the whole width of the broken field, a foot soldier had gone down on one knee. A colour sergeant of a Yorkshire regiment. A big, quiet man with a 2-groove Brunswick rifle. He had seen the horse go down, and the officer pinned, and the horseman come out of the smoke. All of it, small and far off across that dreadful field, and he had knelt and settled the rifle and taken his breath and let half of it go the way you are taught, and in all that noise and smoke and dying light he had made himself as still as a stone. One shot. The sower went off his horse as though a hand had swept him from it. The sabre fell into the mud a foot from Edmund Vane's face and never touched him. The horse bolted riderless into the smoke, and the young lieutenant lay there under his own dead horse, alive, not understanding, staring at the grey sky where the blade had been. The men who saw it, and a few did see it, from the ridge, did not believe it, and then had to. 200 yards and more. Failing light. A moving man on a moving horse. Through smoke. One ball. It was not a shot a man could make. And yet the man had made it, kneeling there quiet, as if he were at the butts on a summer morning. They had a name for him after that, half in jest and half in something nearer to fear. The kestrel. For the way the hawk hangs stone still on the wind, and then falls, all at once, exact, upon the one small thing far below. His name was Collier Sergeant Silas Renwick. They wrote him up. There was a dispatch, you will hear of it again, that named the feat and named the man, and said there had been nothing to equal it in the whole campaign. There was a medal to come, the Punjab Medal, with its clasps for the battles he had stood in. There was talk of more, but Silas Renwick did not want it. He had a wife at home in Yorkshire he had married on his last leave and never yet lived with, and a war he had come to hate, and a growing quiet certainty that he had killed enough men for one life. When his term let him, he bought himself out. He took his medal and his dispatch and his old rifle, and he went north, home, to a small stone cottage on a moor. And he wrapped the past in oilcloth and put it in the bottom of a chest, and he did not speak of it again. Not to his wife, not to his daughter, not, in 30 years, to a living soul. And when, years after, a certain Edmund Vane, risen now, a colonel, then a general, at last a duke, and never in all that time able to forget the day he did not die, went looking through the old muster rolls for the marksman who had saved him, to find him and to thank him as a man ought to be thanked, he found only that Collier Sergeant Renwick had bought himself out long since and vanished north, and could not be traced, and was very likely dead. Now you hold it all. You know the old keeper on the moor with the mud on his rifle is the kestrel of Chilianwala. You know the silver-haired duke at the end of the line is the boy who did not die under his horse. You know the rusted 2-groove Brunswick that Rupert Fanshawe threw in the wet grass is the very rifle that made the impossible shot. You know it all, and not one man on that moor knows any part of it. Not Rupert, Not Croft, not the boy, not even the Duke, though something in him has begun, terribly, to stir. Hold it. It is a hard thing to hold, knowing, while they laugh. But hold it a little longer. For the Duke had come. He had arrived the day before the great drive, the guest of honour, and Rupert had all but bowed himself flat, and at the line-up that first morning, presenting his estate like a shopkeeper laying out his best cloth, Rupert had waved a careless hand down the field toward the old keeper standing apart. My keeper. Renwick, 30 years on the moor, been here longer than the heather. Past his best, I'm afraid. I've a modern man coming in. Renwick, the Duke, had said nothing, but at the name his hand had closed on his gun a little, and he had looked, really looked, down the line at the bent old man in the patched coat, and for one long moment something moved in his face like a man hearing a tune he knew as a child and cannot place. Renwick, it was a common enough name in the north, and the man was old and bowed and grey, and 30 years lay between the Duke and the one glimpse he had ever had of his saviour, which had been of a distant kneeling figure across a smoking field, no face to it at all. He could not make the two into one. There was no reason on earth the kestrel should be keepering grouse on a Yorkshire moor. He let it pass, but it had gone into him, the name, and it did not leave. And there was the rifle. The Duke was a soldier before he was anything, and a soldier's eye had gone to the thing on the old man's shoulder and known it at once for what it was. Not a keeper's fowling piece at all, but a service rifle, a two-groove, a soldier's weapon, worn to rust, but a soldier's weapon still. What was a keeper doing with such a thing? He had meant to go closer, to look at it, to ask. But the horn had blown for the first drive, and the moment had gone by. Still, a soldier's rifle, on the shoulder of a man named Renwick. It sat in him beside the name, and would not settle. You see now why the Duke did not laugh that grey morning when the rest of them roared. You see why his head came up, and now the last morning of the shoot was upon them all, the third day, the great day, the day Rupert Fanshawe meant to close his bargain and save his neck. And Rupert, to crown it, to show himself the modern sporting man before the Duke, had planned something bigger than grouse. He had brought up his own fine new rifles from town, and he meant a stag drive, a deer drive on the wild deer ground at the moor's far edge, the broken country where the great red stags came out of the corries. It was reckless. It was ground that wanted care, and a steady man, and long knowing, and Rupert had none of the three. But it would look magnificent, and the Duke would see him bring down a royal stag, and that was all that Rupert Fanshawe ever asked of anything, that it look magnificent. The keepers were to place the guns and drive the deer down. Croft, the new man, took the high posts, the easy famous ones where the gentleman would stand, and the low post, the poor post, the awkward one down in the broken ground at the mouth of the drive, where no gentleman would stand, and no keeper wanted to. The one place from which a man could see the whole sweep of the dangerous ground and do nothing grand at all, that post nobody wanted. Silas took it. He did not ask for it, and he did not explain it. He simply went, quietly, before the light was full, and set himself down in the low broken ground at the foot of the drive, where he could see it all, the high butts, where the gentleman would stand, the long slope the deer would come down, the tangle of bracken and gorse and fallen stone between, the one place from which an old man could watch over a careless party that despised him. It was not a scheme. Silas Renwick never schemed in his life. It was only what he was. 30 years of keeping the moor had made watching over people the shape of his soul, and he could no more stop doing it than stop breathing, not even for the men who had thrown his rifle in the mud. And there, in the grey before the drive, alone in the low ground with no one to see, he did a thing he had not done in 30 years. He took the rusted Brunswick down off his shoulder. He drew powder from an old flask in his coat, and slowly, with those folded certain hands, he loaded it. Powder, wad, ball, a single round ball, the first the old rifle had carried in 30 years. Ram, cap, he worked the lock once to feel it, and it answered him, worn but true, the way an old dog will still come to a whistle it has not heard in years. He did not know why. That is the truth of it, and you must believe it, for the whole weight of what is coming rests on it. He could not have told you why he loaded the rifle that morning, only that the ground was dangerous, and the gentlemen were fools, and the boy was out there somewhere in the bracken, driving the deer, and some old deep part of Silas Renwick that had knelt once on a smoking ridge in the Punjab would not let him sit in that broken ground with an empty gun, while people he was bound to protect stood in harm's way and did not know it. So he loaded it, and he said nothing. And he waited, still as a stone, still as a hawk on the wind, while up on the high ground the horns began to blow, and the great reckless drive began, and somewhere out in the gorse below him, small and unknowing, the boy who could not meet his eyes walked straight into the path of it. The horns came down the wind, and the moor woke to noise. Silas did not move. He stood in the low ground with the loaded rifle across his arm, and let the drive come to him the way weather comes. Up on the high butts the guns were laughing already. He could hear it. That thin, easy laughter of men who have never in their lives been cold or afraid, men who shoot for the morning and go into their claret at noon. He knew the sound of it now. 3 days had taught him. Above him, spread along the crest, the 40 guns stood in their line, and at the far right end of it, apart, quiet, the silver-haired man watched the ground and said nothing. The deer came first as a shiver in the bracken, then as shapes. A dozen hinds breaking downhill, and behind them, driven hard, the great stag Rupert Fanshawe had marked for himself the night before over his brandy. A royal head. 12 points. The master of Blackmoor wanted that stag on his hall floor before the Duke went home, and he wanted it shot in front of the Duke, and he had brought his fine new rifles down from town to do it. "Stand still, damn you," Rupert called along the line. "Nobody fires till I do." Somewhere below in the gorse, small and unseen, the beaters worked the ground. Tom was among them, 14 years old and ashamed, driving the deer up toward the guns with a stick and his own thin voice, doing the work that fed him. He did not look up at the low post. He had not looked at his grandfather in 2 days. The stag came on. Rupert raised his new rifle. He was a poor shot and did not know it, the way such men never do. He fired too soon and too high. The ball went over the beast's shoulders and whined off into the heather, and the stag flinched and swung and kept its feet. Reload, Rupert snapped. Croft, Croft, the second gun. Julian Croft was slow with it. His new tweed was very fine, and his hands were not. By the time the second rifle came up, the stag had turned along the slope, and Rupert fired again, and this time the ball struck, but it struck wrong. Silas saw where it went, low and back, into the belly and the great muscle of the flank. A gut shot. The worst shot a man can make on a deer, the shot that does not kill and does not stop, the shot that only maddens. He had seen it 100 times in 30 years, and cleaned up after it 100 times, tracking a wounded beast through the dark with a lantern and a knife so it would not die slow in a ditch. He knew what a gut-shot stag would do before it did it. It screamed. A stag can scream. Few gentlemen have ever heard it, and none of them forget it. And then it charged. Not up the hill at the guns, down, away from the pain and the noise, downhill, into the low ground, into the gorse, blind and huge and dying, and full of rage. Better than 400 weight of animal running for its life along the very line where the beaters worked. "It's coming down." Someone shouted on the crest. "It's turned, it's gone down the hill." And Tom stood up out of the bracken. The boy had heard the scream and not known it, had risen to see, the way a boy will, and now he stood full in the open on the deer path, with the stag coming straight at him and the bracken tangled round his legs. He tried to run. His foot caught. He went down hard in the gorse, on his back, and the great beast was on him in 3 strides more, head lowered, the 12 points of that royal head dropping to gore. On the crest the 40 guns did nothing that could help. A man fired and missed clean, too far, afraid to hit the boy. Another stood frozen with his rifle at half raise. Croft turned and ran for the horses without a backward look, his fine tweed flapping. Rupert Fanshawe simply stood with his mouth open and his empty rifle in his hands, and at the end of the line the Duke of Carrow began to run, an old man of 55 running downhill through heather, shouting, and he was 200 yards away and more, and he would not reach the boy in time, and he knew it, and his voice broke on the shout. But down in the low ground, at the post nobody wanted, an old man was already moving. Silas Renwick did not run. There was no time to run, and he knew there was no time, so he did not waste it. He did the one thing 30 years and one terrible night had made the whole shape of him. He brought the rusted Brunswick up to his shoulder. The stock came into the hollow of his cheek, where it had lived 1,000 times, 40 years ago, on ridges and walls and the parapets of hill forts. His left hand steadied under the barrel, folded and certain and still. His breath went out of him slow and stopped. The world narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of the tunnel was the shoulder of a running stag, and beyond it, an arm's length beyond it, a boy on his back in the gorse. 200 yards. Better than 200, a running target, quartering, downhill, in bad light, with a rifle that had not fired in 30 years and a single ball he had rammed home before dawn, not knowing why. No man there could have made that shot, not one of the 40, not on their best day with their finest gun. Silas Renwick made it the way you breathe out. The old rifle spoke. One flat crack rolled across the moor and came back off the far scar, and the smoke stood up white in the grey air. And the stag, mid-stride, running full, dropped as if the ground had opened under it. Dead before it fell. The ball had gone in behind the shoulder and found the heart, clean, the way a ball is meant to, and 400 weight of animal ploughed forward into the gorse and slid and stopped, an arm's length from the boy. Close enough that the spray of torn heather went over Tom's face. Close enough that one of the great points of the antler lay across his ankle, where he could feel the weight of it, and then there was no sound on the whole moor at all. The horns had stopped. The beaters had stopped. The 40 guns on the crest stood in a long silent row and stared down at the low ground, at the dead stag, at the small boy climbing to his knees, and at the bent old keeper lowering a smoking rifle from his shoulder with hands that did not shake. Silas set the butt of the rifle down on the heather and leaned on it a moment. Not from weakness, from the thing that comes after, that only soldiers know, the great grey tiredness that comes down over a man when the shot is made and the world does not end. He looked at his grandson kneeling in the gorse. Tom looked back at him, and for the first time in 2 days the boy did not turn his eyes away. Down the hill, alone, one man was still moving. The Duke of Carrow came on through the heather. He had stopped shouting. He came slowly now, and his hat was gone, lost in the running, his silver hair loose in the wind. He was not looking at the boy. He was not looking at the dead stag. He was looking at the old man and the old rifle, and his face had gone the colour of ash, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has seen a ghost walk up out of 30 years of ground. He did not stop until he was close. 10 feet. Then 5. Then he stood in front of Silas Renwick, and he looked at the rifle in the old man's hands, the rusted 2-groove Brunswick with the leather round the stock, and his lips moved before any sound came. When the sound came, it was very quiet. It was almost nothing. It was meant for no one but the old man, and only those nearest ever swore they heard it. "The kestrel," said the Duke of Carrow. Silas Renwick went very still. 30 years. 30 years he had kept it sealed in oilcloth at the bottom of a chest, kept it off his own tongue, kept it out of the boy's ears, buried it deeper than he had buried Martha under the yew. And a duke stood on a Yorkshire moor and said the name the regiment had given him on a smoking ridge in the Punjab, and it was as if the ground had spoken it. The old man did not answer. He could not. Some things a man cannot answer. But the Duke had seen the answer in his face. And now the Duke of Carrow turned. He turned to face the long line of guns coming down the hill toward them, the 40 gentlemen who had laughed for 3 days, and he did not lower his voice now. He raised it. He threw it up the slope so every man on that moor would hear it and carry it home. Gentlemen, the word cracked like the rifle had. For 3 days you have laughed at this man. You have laughed at his coat and his years, and at that rifle you called a museum piece. Rupert Fanshawe had stopped 10 yards off, his own fine rifle hanging in his hand. His mouth was working. No sound came out of it. "I will tell you what that rifle is," the Duke said. On the 13th of January 1849, at a place called Chilianwalla, I was a lieutenant of 22, pinned under my own dead horse in the mud, with the whole of my life measured in the next 2 seconds. There was a sower standing over me with his sabre up. I saw the light run down the blade. I have seen it every night of my life since. He stopped. His voice was not steady now, and he did not try to make it steady. And from a ridge better than 200 yards off, through smoke, in the dark, one rifleman put a single ball through that man before the blade came down. One shot. I never saw who made it. Nobody could tell me. The men who watched it called him the Kestrel, and by the time I could ask his name he had bought himself out of the army and gone north and was never found. He turned back to the old man, and the Duke of Carrow, guest of honour, master of 10,000 acres, took off nothing more because his hat was already gone, so instead he bowed his head to a gamekeeper in a mended coat. "I have looked for you for 30 years, he said. "I never once thought to look among the beaters." The old soldiers came down the hill. There were perhaps a dozen of them among the 40 guns, men who had served, who had heard that name once long ago in a mess or a barrack room, the name that had gone round the army after Chilianwalla like a story told to children. The Kestrel of Chilianwalla. The impossible shot. Half of them had thought it a tale. And now they came down off the crest slowly, one after another, and as they came. Each one of them, without a word, took off his hat. A colonel among them stood before Silas with his grey head bare. "By God," he said softly. "By God, it's true. There was a colonel on the moor said that name on the first morning. Chilianwalla, and a Yorkshire rifleman. And I laughed it off. It was you. It was you the whole time." The Duke held out his hand for the rifle. Silas looked at it a moment. Then he gave it over, the way a man gives over something that has been part of his own body for 40 years, and the Duke took it and turned it in the grey light with great care. He found the place on the stock, worn near smooth, where 2 letters had been cut with a knife by a young colour sergeant's own hand a lifetime ago. He read them aloud so all could hear. S.R. He turned the stock further, and the mark of the regiment beside it. Cut by his own hand. He looked up. Colour Sergeant Silas Renwick. Mentioned in dispatches for a feat of arms the general's own hand called unequalled in the campaign. He looked at the old man over the rifle. "There is a bundle," the Duke said. "It was not a question. A soldier keeps his papers." "Where are they?" And Silas, who had not spoken since the shot, spoke at last. His voice was rough with 30 years of silence. He did not look at the Duke when he said it. He looked at the boy. "Tom," he said, "in the cottage. Bottom of the chest. The oilcloth, tied with cord. Fetch it." The boy ran. He had never run so fast in his life. He was gone over the low ground and up toward the cottage before any man could send a servant, and he came back the same way, red-faced and gasping, holding the bundle in both hands as if it were made of glass. He gave it to his grandfather. Silas turned it once in his old hands, then he gave it to the Duke. The Duke of Carrow knelt down there on the wet heather, in his fine clothes, beside the dead stag, and he untied the cord. He unwound the oilcloth slow, and inside, wrapped as they had been wrapped for 30 years, lay the things a man keeps when he will keep nothing else. A medal on a faded ribbon. The Duke lifted it, and the guns crowded close to see. "The Punjab medal," he said, "and the clasps." Chilianwala Gujarat, he was in the thick of both. His voice had gone thick. He set it down on the oilcloth with great gentleness, as if it might break, and he lifted out the folded paper beneath it, yellow and soft with age along the creases, and he opened it with the care of a man handling something holy. He read it in silence first, to himself. Then he read it aloud, and his voice shook on the reading. Colour Sergeant Silas Renwick, mentioned for a feat of arms unequalled in the campaign, by whose single shot the life of Lieutenant the Honourable Edmund Vane was preserved. The Duke lowered the paper. "My name," he said quietly. "It has been in a chest at the bottom of a Yorkshire moor for 30 years, next to his medal. And I never knew. Now let me tell you of the faces, for this is the part that matters, and each face deserves its own moment." Rupert Fanshawe's drawl was gone. He stood a little apart with his fine rifle still hanging useless in his hand, and he had gone the colour of tallow. You could see it happening in him, if you knew how to look. He had brought the Duke of Carrow to Blackmoor for one reason only. £8,000 stood against the Hall at the Northern Counties and Yorkshire Bank, due at Michaelmas, 6 weeks off, and Rupert Fanshawe had no way on earth to pay it but to charm a duke into standing surety for the debt. 3 days he had spent charming. 3 days he had spent making himself large and clever and modern in the Duke's eyes. And he had built the whole of it on the back of an old servant he had thrown in the mud, and now the Duke of Carrow was on his knees in the heather before that servant, bareheaded, reading his own life out of the old man's chest, and every soul on the moor had seen who Rupert Fanshawe truly was. A young fool who measured men by their coats. There would be no surety now. There would be nothing now. He opened his mouth once, to say something, some word to save himself, and no word came, because there was no word, and he shut it again. Julian Croft was already gone. Somewhere in the middle of it, quietly, the fashionable young keeper Rupert had brought up from the south to take the old man's place, had slunk off to the horses, and was standing among them with his back half turned, pretending to see to a girth. He did not come down. He had wanted the cottage and the wage. He had thought new tweed was the same thing as skill. He stood by the horses in his fine new coat, and could not make himself look at the old man in the mended one, and that was the last anyone much noticed of Julian Croft that morning. The old soldiers stood bare-headed in a row. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the paper had not said. They stood with their hats in their hands, the way men stand at a graveside, and one by one the rest of the guests, the ones who had never served, who did not fully understand, understood enough from the soldiers' faces to fall silent and take their own hats off too, until there was not a covered head on the whole of Blackmoor Moor but the boy's, and the boy was weeping. Tom Renwick stood beside his grandfather with the tears running down his face, and they were not the tears of 2 days ago. 2 days ago he had turned his eyes away, scarlet, ashamed of the old man the gentleman laughed at. Now he stood and looked up at that same old man, and wept because he had been ashamed, and because he saw at last, whole and plain, who it was that had raised him and fed him, and cleaned a rusty rifle by the fire every night of his life, and never once said why. The Duke of Carrow rose from his knees. He gathered the medal from the oilcloth, and he held it out, not to the old man. He had understood something. He held it out to the boy. Silas took it from the Duke's hand first. He turned it once. Then he pressed it into his grandson's small hands and closed the boy's fingers over it, and the only thing the old man said in all of that, the only thing, was the thing he had said once before by the fire when a boy had asked him why he kept the old rusty thing. "It kept better men than me," said Silas Renwick. And the boy held the medal against his chest and could not answer. The Duke would not let it end in words alone. He was a man who had spent 30 years wanting to pay a debt he could never find the man to pay, and now the man stood in front of him, and he would pay it in full, and he would pay it where every soul could witness. He turned once more to the assembled party, and he did not raise his voice this time, for he did not need to. There was not a sound on the moor to raise it over. "You will all hear this," he said, "and you will carry it home. This man is keeper of Blackmoor, and shall die keeper of Blackmoor. The cottage is his for life, and his grandson's after him, by my word, and I will put my word in writing before I sleep tonight. His pension of £30 a year, promised him by a better man than the one who tried to take it, is restored, and I will stand it myself out of my own purse if need be, and it will not be needed. For there is not a bank in England that would refuse the surety of the Duke of Carrow, and here, only here." He let his eyes rest one cold moment on Rupert Fanshawe for a cause that I judged worthy. He let that hang. Every man there understood it. The surety Rupert Fanshawe had come to beg for the hall would never now be given. It would go instead, in the same breath, to keep an old servant in his cottage. The £8,000 would fall due at Michaelmas with nothing behind it. And the young master's fine sporting life would fall due along with it, and the man who had thrown a rifle in the mud had done it all to himself in front of everyone he had meant to impress. Silas Renwick could have stood and watched him ruined. He had earned the right, if any man ever earned it. He did no such thing. He stepped forward to the Duke, and he inclined his old head, and he said, "Your Grace is too good to me. I never did it for thanks. I would not want the young master hurt on my account." And that plain word, spoken by the old man to the very Duke whose word was ruining Rupert Fanshawe, was worse for Rupert than any triumph could have been. For it showed the whole moor, past all doubting, the size of the man he had thrown in the mud, and the smallness of the man who threw him. The humility of it crushed Rupert Fanshawe more completely than any revenge Silas could have taken. Silas took no revenge at all. He never once raised his voice, never once threw a word back, never once reached for the fine rifle to point it where it might have been pointed. He only stood there, being what he was, and it was more than Rupert Fanshawe could bear to stand near. The old man picked up his rifle from where the Duke had leaned it. He touched the worn stock once with his thumb, over the 2 letters cut there a lifetime ago. Then he put his other hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Come, Tom," he said. "There's a beast to be dressed before the flies find it, and the light's going. Duke or no Duke, the moor doesn't keep itself." And with that, with a Duke bareheaded behind him, and 40 gentlemen silent, and a young master ruined in the heather, the old gamekeeper turned and walked home across his own moor with the boy beside him, the rusted rifle on his shoulder and the medal in the boy's 2 hands, and he did not look back at any of them, not once. The following spring came soft over Blackmoor. The heather was not yet out. It was the low green time of the year, when the moor lies quiet and the curlews come back, and their long bubbling call runs over the tops in the evening the way it has since before there were men to hear it. The light came slantwise and gold across the grouse ground the way it does in April, and the beck ran full and loud in the gill below the keeper's cottage. Inside the cottage the fire was lit against the evening chill, and above the hearth, on the 2 pegs where it had hung for 30 rusted years, hung the Brunswick rifle. But it did not hang rusted now. An old man's hands had worked at it all through the winter evenings, cleaned and oiled and cleaned again, until the barrel came up dark and true and the lock worked sweet. and the leather at the stock had been renewed with a good new strip cut and stitched by the same hands. It was a soldier's rifle again. It gleamed a little in the firelight, and beside it, on the mantel below in a small frame the boy had made, hung the Punjab medal on its faded ribbon, where a man could see it every time he sat down to his supper. Silas Renwick was still keeper of Blackmoor, and would die keeper of Blackmoor in the cottage where Martha lay buried 3 fields off near the yew in Kelthwaite churchyard. The Duke's word had held, as a Duke's word does. The paper had come, signed and sealed, within the week, and it lay folded now in the same chest where the oilcloth used to lie. £30 a year. The cottage for life. His debt of gratitude paid where another man's £8,000 had not been. For Rupert Fanshawe was gone from the county. Michaelmas had come and the debt with it, and there had been no surety and no Duke and no way, and the bank had taken what banks take. Blackmoor Hall was in the hands of trustees now, shut up, its shutters closed, and the young master who had brought his fine rifles down from town was gone away south to whatever life is left to such men. And the county did not much miss him, and that is all that need be said of Rupert Fanshawe. Julian Croft had gone back to town in his new tweed before the first snow, and nobody sent for him, and nobody spoke of him after, and that is all that need be said of Julian Croft. But young Tom Renwick walked the moor now as under-keeper. He was 15 that spring, and taller, and there was a stick in his hand and a dog at his heel, and a way of holding his head that had not been there the autumn before. He knew every gill and peat hag and grouse-butt on the Blackmoor ground, for the old man had taught him, and he walked it in the gold evening light unashamed. And when a farmer or a carter passed him on the low road and touched his cap and said, "Now then, young Renwick, that's the grandson of the kestrel, that is," the boy did not turn his eyes away. He stood straight and he said, "Aye, that's my grandfather," and he was proud, and he had earned the right to be, for he had learned what it cost. On the mantel, beside the medal, stood one thing more. A card, a visiting card, thick and cream-coloured, with a coronet on it and a few lines written under in a strong old hand. It was the Duke of Carrow's card, and on it he had written an open invitation, standing always, to come to Carrow whenever the old man wished, to sit at the Duke's own table as his honoured guest for as long as he lived. Silas Renwick never took it up. He was asked the once, by a neighbour who had seen the card, why he did not go, why he did not spend his last years in a great house being made much of by dukes and generals, he who had earned it, if any man had. The old man thought about it a while, the way he thought about everything, slow and certain, looking into the fire. "I've a wife in the churchyard yonder," he said at last, "and a moor to keep, and a boy to raise. A man's place is a man's place. I'd sooner be here." And that was the whole of it, and the neighbour understood, or came near enough. So the old man kept his moor, and raised his boy, and cleaned his rifle by the fire of an evening, and walked of a Sunday to the yew in Kelthwaite churchyard where Martha lay, and stood a while, and said nothing, and came home. The great world went on without him, as it had gone on for 30 years, while a legend cleaned a rusty gun in a stone cottage, and nobody knew. He had never once told it. He had never needed to be known to be what he was. For that is the way of the quiet ones. Respect is not a thing they demand, or a thing they buy with a fine coat and a loud voice. It is a thing they earn in silence, over long years, in the doing of hard things well, when no one is watching. And the world, being the world, most often looks straight past them, and laughs, and throws their rifle in the mud. But now and again, once in a long while, the truth of a man walks up out of the ground and stands bareheaded before everyone, and names him, and pays him in full what was owing all along. The fire burned low in the keeper's cottage. Above the hearth the old rifle gleamed, no longer rusted, and outside on the darkening moor the curlews called, and the beck ran on, and an old soldier sat quiet in his own chair in his own home, at peace, and asked the world for nothing more than it had already, at the last, been decent enough to give. If you've a quiet one like that in your own life, someone the world looked past, someone who never told you all they were, comment where you're watching from tonight and tell me about them. I should very much like to know how far this old soldier's story travels.